One way of thinking about the BRI is as a mechanism for global connectivity, imagining a new Asia, a new Eurasia, in which India and China are actually partnering together. And I think the larger challenge for not just India and China, but countries like Pakistan, other countries in the region, China can't afford not to be looking at Central Asia and just wondering about how viable these states actually are. So it has more of a stake.
Hello and welcome to New Wave History. And I'm really delighted to be joined by Professor Hassan Karrar from LUMS. And he's an associate professor there specializing in China and Central Asia. Welcome, Hassan. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
And we're going to have a very, hopefully, engaging discussion on the BRI and China's rise as an economic giant, and in particular, the idea of Belt and Road Initiative. And Hassan, before we begin going into that, just tell the viewers what is BRI?
So
there's so many definitions. If you even Google them, you'll find out. So how would you see that as an imaginary, as a construct?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So the BRI stands for the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Belt and Road Initiative can simply be thought of. There's a couple of ways of thinking about it. One way of thinking about the BRI is as a mechanism for global connectivity. So if you put BRI into a search engine, and if you look up images of BRI, what you will invariably come across is an outline map of the world, and you'll see that you have thick lines running across much of the globe's territory. And these lines represent economic corridors. So simply put, we can say that the BRI is a mechanism for connectivity. Going one step deeper, we can say that the BRI is a mechanism for the Chinese state, Chinese SOEs, and private Chinese entrepreneurs to invest in countries. And we find that this investment mechanism is now functional in about 100 different countries. I think the thing to keep in mind is that the BRI is being unrolled and has been unrolled since 2013. And the BRI has China as an anchor point. So you can't have BRI without China. So China is central to BRI. It's an idea that comes out of China during the Xi Jinping era.
Yes, and thank you. And so it has also been referred to as the reincarnation of the old Silk Route. I mean, of course, old routes never go away. But what was that Silk Route as well? And how? And what are the differences or the similarities between the two?
That's an excellent question. It's also a very big question. So one way of thinking about the Silk Road is as a mechanism that existed across Eurasia through much of recorded history, whereby you had the transmission of ideas, religions, Buddhism, Islam, material culture. And when we say that this was a mechanism for transmission of ideas, material culture across Eurasia, what we are essentially referring to is an East-West movement that existed for the best part of 2,000 years. The word Silk Road was actually coined in the late 19th century. It was coined by a German geographer. So prior to that point in time, people didn't refer to this connectivity as the Silk Road. This was simply people doing what they always did, which was, trading with neighboring villages. In some instances, you had the movement of ideas, transmission of Buddhism and Islam, obviously being the two key ideas that move along the so-called Silk Road. But after the term was coined, different individuals, states, they found it to have quite a bit of political currency. And especially towards the end of the 20th century, we end up finding that the Silk Road then starts to refer to an imagined connectivity that existed outside of European hegemony, Europe and its empire in Asia and the Indian Ocean. So the Silk Road became a way of talking about connectivity, but decentering and, if you may, marginalizing the role of Europe, where Europe was one stop along the Silk Road And it was a stop, just like Central Asia might be a stop, India might be a stop, China might be a stop. So it gave us a vocabulary to talk about connectivity outside of Europe and its empire in the Indian Ocean and Asia.
And in the intervening centuries, of course, we also saw rise of European ideas in particular, and Enlightenment and modernity. And then the world that we live in is pretty much shaped by them.
Absolutely.
But as we see now with the BRI, Europe is once again marginal. It's just another place you have to go through or pass through.
That's right. And that's the story of the rise of China, especially in the last 25 years. And China going global, the fact that in the 1990s or the 1980s, if one talked about FDI, foreign direct investment in China, in one sentence, then the assumption was that one was talking about FDI coming into China. But when you get to the 21st century, what you end up seeing is that the story shifts completely. There's a 180-degree shift whereby FDI starts going outside of China. And after 2013, China is the largest exporter of FDI. So that new Silk Road imaginary, BRI, is really backed by, it's empowered by the fact that China has become an economic superpower, and it has the money and the resources, and especially after 2008, it has the capacity to invest in other countries the way in which the West no longer does.
So much like as the Silk Route, other than being a major global trading pathway, it was also a means of transfers of ideas, cultures, technologies. And the BRI, has it been imagined in the similar fashion, or is it serving the similar purpose? Because I have a follow-up question on that, but
It's framed in a similar fashion. So the Silk Road imaginary is, and the Silk Road iconography, if you may, is embedded within the literature that is produced about the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you look at the iconography that's associated with the BRI and the publications about BRI, what you'll often find is that there will be a small sketch in the corner of a publication, an official publication. There'll be an image of sand dunes and silhouettes of camels plodding over these sand dunes. There might be once again a silhouette of a pagoda with the sort of typical roofs, and you recognize the Silk Road iconography.
Yeah, very East Asian sort of.
East Asian sort of, and the sort of camels on the sand dune are very, very, very Silk Road-esque. I mean, it's that has become ubiquitous. So that's the way in which BRI is packaged. But
it's not the same.
Underneath BRI is what I like to think of as an investment mechanism. And this is an investment mechanism whereby capital, which is coming from different sources. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify things and work with the assumption that it's just coming out of one pot of money. The money is coming from different sources, but essentially what we're looking at is an investment mechanism whereby the money is being invested in power generation, in ports, in railway construction, in the construction of the so-called digital Silk Road, in other words, new forms of digital connectivity, internet connectivity. And essentially, this new Silk Road is to a large extent about infrastructure. It's about hard infrastructure, roads, ports, railway lines. Whereas the old Silk Road was never a road. It was basically people walking along a goat path, or people scrambling over sand dunes. So that was a Silk Road, a connectivity void of infrastructure. This one, to a very large extent, depends on hard physical infrastructure.
Hard physical, yes, that's a big change. But there is also a view that through the BRI, the Chinese ideas of progress, or what they call development or welfare, they are also being exported or at least showcased at the global stage.
Yes.
whether it's Central Asia, and we'll talk about that as well because that's another area of your research. But if you look at parts of Africa, Latin America, and of course, there are very divergent views on that. Some people welcome that. The others say, no, it's authoritarian, it's Maoism, it's a lot of bloodshed, etc. So how far is China, other than an instrument of economic nationalism, using the BRI as also an export, so to speak, of the Chinese philosophy, or the contemporary philosophy of how it views progress?
Yeah, so what I would say on that is that, if we say that this is something that China is actively doing, then we're giving agency to China. That may or may not be the case, but certainly some ideas about the Chinese model of development are directly or indirectly finding traction in many receiving countries. One is the role of infrastructure. And there is a notion in Pakistan. I find that this notion is more pronounced in parts of Africa. But there is this notion that our development capacities are being held back because we don't have adequate infrastructure. And in parts of Africa, this idea is very, very pronounced.
Yes.
That if we upgrade the infrastructure, then we will be able to realize our development capacities. And you can make an argument that this is the Asian model of development, not necessarily just the Chinese model of development, but this is sort of an East Asian model of development or a Southeast Asian model of development. So in other words, there is an infrastructure-led development that can be realized once host countries have developed their infrastructural capacity. So that's one idea that begins to permeate post-BRI. The other is this narrative of poverty reduction, which we hear a lot about in Pakistan. So, our leaders look to China as a country which lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which China did. I don't think there's any doubt about the fact that since the Deng Xiaoping years, hundreds of millions of people in China have been lifted out of poverty. What tends to get obscured in the way in which our leaders and politicians make this statement is the very complex historical processes that were undergirding this process. And then likewise, anti-corruptionism as well. So these are all ideas which leaders associate with China, with the type of progress China has made, the type of developmentalism that we've seen in China in the last 50 years. And I think these ideas are becoming much more pronounced after 2013 and BRI.
Yeah, I think this particular poverty reduction focus is something. So, I teach international development. Yeah. I've been a practitioner myself, and often in our classroom, that's where the conflict or let's say the contradiction emerges, because I cite the Chinese success and the various methods and instruments which were used. But at the same time, students question, they say, well, what about democracy, and what about human rights and inclusion, and are these compatible? And that's where I was getting at, because if you see what we are also witnessing, at least in the procedural democracy framework, there's a global decline. Not just in Pakistan or South Asia, but globally we are seeing that as well. And some of the countries or important, influencers actually cite the Chinese model. They say we really don't need democracy for growth. We don't have to have democratic development for progress, for welfare at a mass scale. And often then one is baffled by that question, So how would you address that, Hassan?
Well, it's a tough one. It's sort of opening up a
Pandora's box.
Yeah, Pandora's box. I think that, look, ultimately it's up to the people to decide what path of development they want to go down. I think this is a decision that is up to the people of a country, and certainly the Chinese path of development has yielded success. It's not the only path of development. I think that there's many paths to development. Ultimately, I think it's really a question of deciding, and it's up to the people to decide,
of course,
where one wants to go and how best they want to get there. And
yeah.
I mean,
I know. I often think about it that maybe the way inclusion is imagined and practiced is different in China. I mean, you have local governments.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have a very well organized Communist Party machine, very intrusive at the same time, but very much present as a mode of accountability of public officials. So anyway, I'm getting sidetracked because I just thought taking advantage of your presence.
No, it's a fascinating
Dr. Karrar.
No, it's a
But let's get back to BRI.
Sure.
And with hundreds of billions of dollars already invested and more, trillions imagined in the coming decades, what has been the key success? I mean, what have been the overall sort of successes of the BRI so far? I mean, of course, it's too early because, this is a kind of a long-term rollout. How does China and perhaps the Chinese officials and their, thinkers view BRI's progress?
That's a good question. It's a tough one as well. I think that one success would be that for China at least, the BRI has allowed Beijing to emerge as the foremost actor as far as the pursuit of large-scale infrastructure financing and construction is concerned. Now,
right.
This is notwithstanding the fact that a lot of Chinese infrastructure development is outside of the BRI framework. But if you look at railway constructions globally, it's all China.
Yes.
If you look at pretty much most of the major infrastructural sectors, one finds that China is the dominant actor. And I think whether or not that would still have happened without BRI is a hypothetical question, but BRI certainly has showcased China's extraordinary capacity to finance and build spectacular infrastructure. So I think that's no doubt one of the successes of China and BRI. The other thing that I find very interesting as far as BRI is concerned is that it's amplified a very positive and favorable image of China in different parts of the world. And I base this upon scores of conversations that I have in Pakistan, whereby everyone from small traders in Gilgit-Baltistan to business people who travel to China regularly, to my colleagues in science and engineering at LUMS, they all come back from China with this really, gung-ho, and they're completely taken in by the extraordinary development that they're witnessing in China. Sort of got the very, very similar impression in interviews that I was doing in Kenya 2 years ago. So the Belt and Road Initiative really has done a lot to amplify China's soft power. I mean, there's, I think, 30,000 Pakistani students who are studying in China at this point in time. That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
So I think these are very real gains for China, certainly, but also for the receptor countries. I think in subtle ways and gradual ways, we are seeing these, I'm going to say, positive impacts of BRI. It wasn't quite the game changer that it was said it was going to be in 2015, 2016. It's not as if we woke up one morning and everything had changed. That didn't happen. But in other subtle ways, I think that there have been these fairly significant positives that have come out of it.
Yes. So great soft power, absolutely. The expansion, I mean, it's palpable, and you can see that even even the Western hostile press, which I follow very intently because I live in the US, as you know, on a daily basis, even they have started to make concessions. There was a time Harvard Business Review would say, oh, there's no innovation happening in China. And now with the deep sea and all, they have to read the words and say, oh, this is the hub of innovation and a leader or whatever. Small example. But anyway, getting back, so other than the soft power, but there's also an expansion or at least an engagement with hard power from a geopolitical lens. One of the regions that you focus on, Dr. Karrar, in your research is Central Asia. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all these stans after the end of Cold War, which emerged as these countries, and they are now are not just connected but getting deeply connected with China in energy transactions, in trade, in other areas. And other places, South Asia, we'll shortly talk about that, Pakistan especially, but then Sri Lanka and now Bangladesh. Of course, India is an outlier, and we'll also talk about that. But what has been this relationship with Central Asia, and how, and because I'm looking at some of your papers, I was, that there are some transformational bits as well, which are, underway. But there's also a fortification, if I may say so, of existing power structures of status quo in terms of how political power is distributed in the different countries of Central Asia.
Yeah. So I think the last bit is very easy to respond to. And I think that the Chinese position would be, and I would completely agree with them on this, is that as far as the political structures are concerned, political structures internal to a given state, that's of no interest to them. So that tenet of Chinese foreign policy, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, I think that applies everywhere. That certainly applies to Central Asia as well. Central Asia and China, that relationship is an interesting one. And that relationship is an interesting one because to an extent it builds off the earlier relationship that China had with the Soviet Union. Central Asia, the Central Asian republics were of course a part of the Soviet Union prior to 1991. And to an extent, one can say that the relationship post-1991, in other words, beginning from January 1992 onwards, which is when diplomatic recognition was extended by China to the republics, that builds off of what had become, by the late 1980s, close relations between China and the Soviet Union. So as you know, the Sino-Soviet split had really intensified in the 1960s, 1970s. But by the time we get to the 1980s, relations between the Soviet Union and China start improving. And then that goodwill carries forward into the 1990s as well. Now, there's one or two very important specificities about that relationship between China and the Central Asian republics. One is that they share a long border. So all of a sudden in 1991, 92, China realized that it had 5 new neighbors beyond its border. And these were states which were experiencing economic precarity. There was a degree of uncertainty as to how viable the Central Asian states were. I'm talking about the popular discourse in 92, 93. Would they exit the ruble zone? The Soviet currency was still the currency in the Central Asian states, at least initially. Whether there would be employment opportunities for the Central Asian people, unemployment was skyrocketing, so on and so forth. So here what we find is that China can't afford to have China can't afford not to be looking at Central Asia and just wondering about how viable these states actually are. So it has more of a stake in the Central Asian states than it would, say, for example, in a country which is more distant from itself. What happens beyond its borders is going to directly affect and impact China. And, this is work that I was doing much earlier. But China had a very, very measured approach to the Central Asian republics, predicated on this notion that it needed it needed to be supportive of these new states, these new economies, to the extent that was possible as a way of ensuring that there is stability in the region. And we see that ultimately in the form of investments in Central Asian energy and sort of an integration into this larger small trade that is spanning out of Xinjiang in Western China. And this is work that I've done more recently, just looking at the movement of small traders, light manufactured goods, the creation of a new Silk Road, one based upon bazaars in Central Asia and small traders shuttling goods back and forth across the border. So the way in which that ends up connecting with this larger geopolitical question is that, that ends up providing employment for hundreds of thousands of people over the years, millions of people in Central Asia and in Russia. And that's a source of stability as well. And what we're seeing more recently, once again, coming back to BRI, is the construction of connectivity infrastructure, if you may, linking China to Central Asia and then now through rail all the way on to Europe.
Yeah, right. So, you've also done work on bazaars, the concept and the notion. Now, of course, there's the Orientalist view of the exotic bazaar, the Istanbul's Grand Bazaar or Egypt's bazaars and Central Asian bazaars. But and then, of course, in development practice also, bazaars are these nodes or mechanisms for exchange and progress and prosperity. But what you mentioned that since CPEC, since BRI's rollout, the bazaars have also, they are under transformation as well. Would you? That's a sense I was getting.
The Central Asian bazaar has a sort of interesting tangent that we're on, and I'm very, very happy to speak about this. The Central Asian bazaar has changed in the last 10 to 12 years. In other words, the time that's coterminous with BRI. What I would say, however, is that that's not a result of BRI. I think that to a large extent, that's a result of... So if you take Kazakhstan, for example, what we find is that since the last 15 years, there's very particular ideas about modernization, about modern aesthetics, about what a modern metropolis ought to look like. So the outward transformation that we're seeing in the Central Asian bazaar, more specifically in bazaars in Kazakhstan, is as a result of this new imaginary, if you may, of what a modern market ought to look like.
That's what I was going to say.
The existing bazaars in Central Asia, or the bazaars that came into existence after 1991, were seen as chaotic places, as uncivilized places. And the official discourse is that we have to civilize these chaotic, unruly places, because that's what a modern state ought to be doing. And then, I suppose, there is a following of Chinese processes. So in, once again, sticking with the example of Kazakhstan, the digital wallet, fintech has become very, very popular. There's been a sharp increase in online retailing. Some of it also had to do with COVID-19 and the way in which that transformed how people, not just in Central Asia, but around the world, were purchasing and sending money.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because that's exactly why I raised this question, because these are kind of the side effects, if I would say, of the larger project at work. So, of course, Africa, you mentioned about your interviews in Kenya and in Latin America. That is also something. President Trump of the United States recently mentioned was alarmed by the Chinese footprint in Latin America. And he should be, rightly so, from a conventional perspective. But coming back to some of the critiques of BRI, now one of obviously is that very in popular discourse, they refer, this is the new East India Company or the new West India Company. And do you agree with such categorization?
No, I don't think it's CPEC is the new East India Company. I think that's a very crude way of looking at the role of CPEC and the role of China in Pakistan. The East India Company is directly linked with the history of empire. The Chinese position would be, and I would completely agree with them on this, is that China was a victim of European empire itself. China is, as one interlocutor in Kenya put it, China is a very recent development partner. So China's international role is barely 20 years old. It's really only in the new century that Chinese foreign direct investment starts going out. So I think that comparisons with European empire are incorrect. All of that being said, I think that there is certainly space to ask questions about how Chinese authority and Chinese economic authority is being deployed. And in different parts of this country, for example, we find concern being raised by people on the ground. This might have to do with the manner in which land is being appropriated. It might have to do with the fact that there is no longer access to the commons. Here I'm thinking about complaint that we've heard very often from the fisher folk in Gavadar, namely the fact that they don't have access to their traditional fishing waters. There are likewise concerns about the environmental impacts. And I think all of these are valid. I think that the voices from the ground ought to be taken into consideration. Yeah. I think that there is more scope for consultative decision-making, a sharing of responsibility going forward. This is something that we see in other parts of the world as well. So once again, going back to the Africa example, if a railway line is being built, what sort of impact is that going to have on the local environment, on wildlife? How is that land being appropriated? Who does that land belong to? Who benefits? Who are, more broadly speaking, I suppose you could say that, and since you teach development, this, but you could say that with any of these large development projects, there are winners and there are losers. Yeah.
And multiple
losers. I think the issue with China specifically, and here again, I sort of keep flipping between my different examples and case studies. But coming back to China and Pakistan, I think that the security imperative that surrounds Chinese nationals in this country and how they have to work means that there is a distance between, say, for example, a Chinese engineer who's working on a project site and the local people. Now, we realize that that is a necessity at this point in time, given the fact that multiple Chinese people have been attacked in this country. But, that ends up creating a separation between communities, local communities, and the people implementing the projects, where ideally that separation would not have existed.
But Chinese, the security of Chinese officials is also a Central Asia problem now with the recent attacks in Tajikistan.
Yes, absolutely.
And, so I guess that is a broader question that is being debated. And I think, Dr. Karrar, this has been so fascinating, quick rush journey through decades of Chinese interventions and imaginary. But, my final question about this is that, this is an idea that has alarmed India and the West as well. I mean, the West, by that I mean the US in particular, the leader. I mean, the Europeans are, by and large, have sort of, accepted that this is the reality. So what do you think that in the coming years would India revise its position? I mean, the President, US under Trump is already making some amends to their historic sort of, alarm bell ringing.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I certainly think so. I don't think global geopolitics is zero sum. I am a student of Chinese diplomacy, and one thing that comes across very clearly from the Chinese side, which I really appreciate, is the fact that, look, this is not a zero-sum game. Just because it is possible to imagine win-win scenarios. Yeah, we use win-win very superficially, it's just become part of political talk. But if you actually think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because essentially what you're saying is that why can't we think beyond a scenario in which there is a winner and a loser? Why can't we think of a scenario in which two sides or three sides or multiple sides end up benefiting? And despite Trumpism, I think that the Chinese have clung to that idea that, look, you can benefit, we can benefit. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. India is also an interesting case in point. And on India, I just sort of have, I just want to say one or two points. And one is that there is, despite the difficult relationship between China and India today, if you go back to the 1950s, what you find is that there's a very real proximity between India and China.
Yeah.
And then you find examples of that proximity earlier in the 20th century as well. In the 1920s, for example, when there's intellectuals who are meeting, who are sharing ideas. And then, obviously, there's a much longer history, transmission of Buddhism from India to China. And then sort of over the centuries, quite a bit of exchange along this so-called Silk Road that we were talking about.
Not to mention
earlier.
The political Maoist struggles.
Yes.
I mean,
sure. Ideologies move across as well. And what's interesting is that the way in which official Chinese discourses will oftentimes talk about India and China, not the politics, but these two entities, is in a civilizational lexicon. And I'm struck by that. There's examples of how, and I've written about this at one point, how the sort of I think it was, I could be wrong, but I think it was might have been Li Keqiang, the former premier, who wrote an editorial in the Hindu, the newspaper. It was called "A Handshake Across the Himalayas."
I read that,
and they talk about how these two civilizations are destined to be together. So I think that there are people in China, certainly, and I would imagine that that's the case in India as well, who are thinking beyond the present difficulties and imagining a new Asia, a new Eurasia, in which India and China are actually partnering together and they're cooperating together. And I think the larger challenge for not just India and China, but countries like Pakistan, other countries in the region, is if one can all be part of this community and find those, if not everyone be friends, but certainly find those points at which one can identify mutual cooperation. One can think about ways in which this can be a beneficial relationship.
Just as actors as normal, regular countries. I mean, it's not too much.
So there's a lot to be gained.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be gained.
Definitely.
In thinking about ways in which these relationships could be reset or conversely made stronger.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karrar.
My pleasure.